right, and Jessica Young's name is here. Don't worry, we will be having a dialogue, or I guess a therapy session, because Eric said they were anxious at Microsoft because of our work. So it's really amazing to get to present. And actually being in a museum about to talk about trustworthy information is particularly evocative for me, because actually museums are some of the most trusted institutions by the public. And this is something I actually think about quite a bit in my work. And obviously, if you get a chance to look at the galleries, there's lots of labels and descriptions of both art and information here that perhaps is related to what I'll be sharing. So my name is Claire Leibowicz. I lead our AI and media integrity work, which began in earnest in 2018 at the Partner Forum that maybe some of you were at before the hand raises for the 3 years ago. And we launched our work on a question of how we have a healthy information ecosystem in the AI age. And while we at PAI have been thinking about deepfakery, synthetic content for a long time, I'd say it was in the past 2 years that it's really entered the public consciousness. Here are just a few examples. On the left, you see ostensibly the Pentagon on fire. That's fake. In the middle, you see this extremely emotional photo from after Hurricane Helene more recently, which was one of many misleading narratives, many of which did not rely upon AI, really importantly. And on the right, this is my AI-generated depiction of a financial services professional, which happened for real, being duped by a deepfake audio to transmit $25 million. But most people have started thinking about this as it related to the super election year, where many of us last year, we had a panel on this very topic. We're worried about some big bellwether deepfake that could affect our democracy. While we didn't see what I think a lot of people anticipated, we saw extensions of existing problems in media manipulation just using AI. So t-shirt iconography is a very common mechanism. You could just slap that on with Photoshop, but look at all these tools that we have to make Elton John look like he is a Trump supporter. So even if we have not yet seen these chaotic deepfakes changing the world, policymakers are notably thinking about how we govern a dual-use technology, think about governance for its myriad uses. And that's a question that we at PAI think about quite often. How can this governance capture the complexity of the synthetic content landscape? The fact that there are myriad institutions thinking about this, ranging from privacy preservation and storytelling and accessibility on the one hand, but also fraud, defamation, disinformation, and many other nefarious uses. So I'm going to introduce how PAI has been thinking about this through our synthetic media framework, describe our latest round of case studies, which have been teed up, offer some takeaways for the field, which will hopefully bleed into lunch, and then have the fun experience of chatting with Jessica from Microsoft. So while we had been working on this question for many years, in February 2023, we launched this artifact. And that was the result of a year-long process where we gathered a ton of input from over 100 stakeholders and in essence created a technology policy. And what was meaningful about that is now we have 18 signatories who represent a microcosm of the AI field in this space, ranging from dating applications to image generators to distributors, newsrooms, and even civil society institutions. And the framework is now in Spanish and French as well, which we're very thrilled to share. And it talks about several topics in this domain, like transparency, how we label AI content, and notably delineates how that guidance may vary whether or not you're a developer, a creator, or a distributor of synthetic content, because different institutions play a different role in the governance pipeline. And we're thrilled that NIST, in their AI Safety Institute convening a few weeks ago, talked about how creation, modification, publication, dissemination, other shuns, consumption, I would add to that list, really require multiple stakeholders to engage. And what was meaningful, I think most meaningful to me personally and for the field, was those institutions were not just putting their names on something that they had already done work for, but they were committing to these in-depth, potentially daunting and anxiety-inducing case reports, which they worked with us for quite some time to produce. And in March, we launched 10 of those, including one from PAI, talking about real-world examples of AI in elections instances. November, 2 weeks ago, we launched 5 more, and we have 5 final ones coming in January. And those cases would do several things. They'd inform public progress reporting on how we apply these principles actually in practice, create this case bank of real-world examples. We hear from many people who are so thrilled that they can look to this. They don't have big teams working on this question, so they can look to these examples, figure out augmentation areas for the framework, and of course, show how institutions are actually enacting our guidance and thinking about these huge questions in reality. Here are the March 2024 cases, and I'll just highlight a few. CBC and BBC took completely different approaches to deepfakery and storytelling. The BBC used face swapping to more authentically and truthfully tell a story about Alcoholics Anonymous to preserve the identity of the individuals depicted, whereas the CBC, and this is quite key, felt that their audience was not ready to confront AI, and that if they used it for good or for truth, it might degrade trust in their real information in other facets of the business. So two completely different approaches. We have amazing work from Witness talking about consent protocols for people who were kidnapped and could not give it in the context of an advocacy piece. And DID, a startup, was talking about using consent to digitally resurrect victims of domestic abuse. And I'll highlight the OpenAI case where they quite introspectively lay out why they chose to adopt authenticity infrastructure signals, C2PA, which some of you may have heard of, on their DALL-E models and what they considered about the field in order to actually do that. And we're so heartened in terms of translating from PAI, which hopefully has front-run the policy community by launching this. I've heard this kind of theme in the morning of being ahead of what's to come a few years from now. And I think we were in the right place at the right time to help, for example, NIST's synthetic content working group transpose some of these real-world examples onto their policymaking. And I'll move into the most interesting part for the last few minutes, which is this human question, which Eric teed up really nicely about how people actually make sense of content on the web and make sense of these technical signals. And there's a nice quote in the NIST report about all of these signals and all of this technical work being interpretable by human beings making sense of content if it's going to be trusted. And PAI has been asking this question of how to communicate AI augmentation for many, many years, even through our deepfake detection challenge work, which was ostensibly just about building technical models for classifying deepfakery or not. We asked, how can you label that for a person to actually interpret that signal in a meaningful way? And that is a major through line in our framework, which I know you're all going to read in detail at syntheticmedia.partnershiponai.org, about disclosing to viewers or listeners how content has been manipulated. And that was the focus of our 5 latest cases. From Meta, Microsoft, researchers at Stanford HAI, TruePic, and the child safety nonprofit Thorn. And I want to talk about the template briefly. That template was much longer than this slide implies, but it asked institutions questions like what research or analysis contributed to how you are labeling content? What evidence would actually cause you to change your mind, helping kind of catalyze future research to inform platform and others' decision-making? And of course, this is a whole nasty web of the relationship between AI labels and accuracy and integrity labels that are very different and actually about content meaning. So I'll zoom in on the Microsoft and Meta case and offer a few concluding thoughts on where we go for trusted information. Microsoft's case focused on what LinkedIn is doing in deploying the C2PA standard, which is a technical intervention to surface information about content. And I'll just share one really kind of potent anecdote from that case. They shared some unreported user research about how very subtle changes in language, saying it was certified or verified or signed by, significantly impacted a consumer's interpretation of these technical signals. Meta also talked about changing their labeling regime from made with AI to the very vague AI info based on creator feedback. And they talk about, while they've adopted certain technical standards, the question of when they surface those and how they describe that continues to percolate. So PAI and my wonderful colleague Christian Cardona and I kind of synthesized this huge body of work from many of our partners to offer a few reflections on trusted information and AI labeling. Firstly, people are not perceiving these AI labels as merely technical descriptions about content. They view them as potentially punitive on creative works, and they imbue them with meaning of true and false, even though iPhone uses AI to manipulate portrait mode. So people are thinking that AI means false, even though that's not necessarily the case. Second, most of the reported edits that Meta at least was surfacing made with AI tools were not significantly changing content's meaning or context. They were color corrections that didn't change the character of an artifact. But interestingly, color correction could have an impact if it was trying to, make a political figure seem like they were wearing blackface. That is an instance where this seemingly immaterial issue could have a material impact, but this is super interesting. Third, creators rarely know that they are creating content with enough AI to warrant a disclosure based on platform policies. So interestingly, many of the social media platforms now rely upon self-disclosure, that I upload and I toggle a button that says I used AI. But most of the creators surveyed did not know that they were using AI in their Adobe tools and beyond. And in this past year, most of the social media platforms we talked to, and more are sharing in January, said they were much more willing to overlabel than underlabel, even if there were unintended consequences about that. A cynical reading is there's fear of regulation. A more positive reading is this is a new technology of vast importance, and we want to overexpose people to greater transparency. And ultimately, you've gleaned this, simply disclosing the presence of AI as an imprecise form of transparency for audiences. It does not translate necessarily to trust. You're obliquely getting at characteristics about content that may not make people trust signals. So I encourage you to look at our long-form policy recommendations, but where do we go from here? We think there's utility in standardizing what visual information depicting this kind of back-end technical data about where content comes from would be really helpful for users. If we take the very commonly described nutrition label, as we're just adding context about food, there are profound normative decisions that are made in this label. Calories is bold-faced. Cholesterol, sodium, they are higher up than many other things at the bottom. These are the choices that a lot of the people implementing the very good work that's happened on back-end metadata and watermarking are asking themselves about how you show this to users, and we think there should be standardization. If you look here, if you're on Facebook, you see something like what's on the left, AI info, and you click into it, whereas on a Microsoft artifact, you see their kind of protocol, and there's a real need to really collaborate on how we do this across the board and when. And also a consideration for bottom-up labeling methods. Interestingly, community-centric labels, I'm not advocating for Elon Musk's Twitter, but community notes is an interesting model of describing content manipulations from people as opposed to kind of top-down and others. So what can we expect in the year to come? We're going to be releasing the final cases. I encourage you to sit down for probably it would take 3 days to read all of them and read all of them. We're going to publish some reflections on the field for the past few years working in this space. And there's a real need to attend to new ethical areas. We could not bite off every aspect of the synthetic content governance question. We focused on kind of outputs and transparency and consent. But what about the inputs and how we train these models and kind of this do not train momentum around how we preserve publisher rights in the years to come? And of course, developing the community, which is a wonderful segue to inviting Jessica Young. So I will stop talking, just me. We can give her a round of applause. Thank you. So you heard from me all about our experience, I'm going to keep saying invoking anxiety in the institutions we work with. And Jessica obviously does not represent all of LinkedIn, though you should add her on LinkedIn at the end of this. I just love to hear what you learned from the process from both your peers and I guess interfacing with us through making sure we had these 10 pages of writing from Microsoft about how you guys are thinking about media integrity.
Yep, thank you for that. So I would say it was an incredible process, and Eric's comments kind of set the stage for our thinking about this, because signing up as a supporter for the synthetic media framework of their responsible practices really has a large breadth for a company like Microsoft. So we're both a builder of Gen AI systems and tools and incorporate disclosure into the outputs of those tools, so the synthetic media produced, and then through an organization like LinkedIn would also display those credentials downstream. So in working on this case study, it was a great opportunity to collaborate with parties across the company and with our colleagues at LinkedIn to bring insights from both those that have worked on our what we call our provenance infrastructure internally that uses C2PA compliance in our products and the disclosures we put in, down to our Office of Responsible AI and policy colleagues there, our collaborators at LinkedIn, both those that have worked on user research and those that have worked on the engineering systems themselves and some of the decisions they had to make and deliberations as they implemented display. And then as well, even our colleagues in Democracy For that work on a lot of the media literacy issues too. So bringing insights across all of those parties into the case study was a great experience, and illuminating too to see some of the deliberations that had to be made early on when you have a platform like LinkedIn that's a professional networking platform that's distributing a distribution platform, as the framework would say, that's trying to display those signals at a scale never done before and implement the C2PA standard, and crossing a lot of those decision points for the first time in terms of how things are made. So,
is there something? So I shared that interesting user research anecdote that was interesting to me, but I'm curious if there's something from the case that you think people, if they don't read the whole thing, should take away from it, or you'd want people to come away with.
Right. So one interesting thing for me was learning, so when LinkedIn first started its implementation of the C2PA standard and display, a lot of the user experience guidance from the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, the standard we've been talking about, was very nascent at the time. So as LinkedIn was incorporating its display, it had to think through, if you're consuming media in a feed and hovering over that icon that indicates metadata information is present, what do you see at that very top level? And so had to think through some of those considerations themselves. And so we talk in the case study about decisions that LinkedIn made initially to say, this content was made in part or whole by AI. That changed based on user feedback, that more granularity would be helpful to know if it was fully AI generated, partially edited, et cetera. So a lot of those insights were worked in, but then also we were able to share back with the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity areas that we saw as opportunities for them coming up with actual UX guidelines that could be communicated for more standardized information, which we expect will continue to evolve too as we see how well these things are working in practice.
And you talked about the multi-stakeholderism inherent to Microsoft itself and all the different teams, but what about working with such a broad coalition at PAI? Did that shape your thinking, or how do you understand what multi-stakeholderism brings to bear on the synthetic content challenge for you all?
Absolutely. I will say I think one of my favorite parts of being part of the AI Media Integrity Group with Partnership on AI is insights that come from all of the diverse actors. So we have insights we see from the different industry partners that are contributing case studies, parties like BBC that are thinking through this from a media or news organization lens. You have parties like Witness and Thorn that are thinking through civil society perspectives. So that's been fascinating. And I think a lot of the opportunities that are highlighted in the case study as future directions are those that really require diverse stakeholders across all of these parties leaning in to help answer some of these questions going forward. So just a few examples. We briefly touched upon what's displayed and how, and that top level. So there's so many considerations there to make sure that's what's displayed is working well for all of those parties. If you see, so for instance, on LinkedIn, you'll see a high-level assertion about, is the content camera captured? Is it fully AI generated, partially, et cetera? What was the source that signed that assertion? What was the date? All of these pieces of information. But the idea being that if you're an advertiser or a news organization or a content creator, you might have information that you think is very important to surface to users in different parties. So that may or may not come through depending on the distribution platform and what you see. So continual feedback to improve that. User research is one thing we talk about a lot. And so the idea of assessing how effective are these disclosures and what's conveyed working in practice. So of course, that's research from each of these industry organizations that are trying to implement, surface to broader coalitions like the Content Provenance for C2PA that can have broader guidelines to help standardize things, but also organizations like Witness that are seeing how well these signals work in practice, kind of building on what Sam was talking about with the deepfake task force. And are they being interpreted correctly or well, and where could things be improved. So a lot of research to build on that. And then, of course, media literacy. One thing we talk about in the case study is we launched, along with OpenAI, a $2 million fund to further media literacy efforts, including building on important work PAI is doing, but the need for so much more work to be done there, both by, at the federal level, state level, internationally, of course, too, but with civil society groups as well, to make sure that as these disclosure tools are presented and these methods are employed, kind of at an increasing pace now, that knowing none of them are foolproof, do people interpret them well? How are they being used or misused? But also thinking through, do people understand their capabilities and limitations, and are they making informed decisions based on that as well?
And I think we have time. I didn't tell Jessica we would ask her this, but do you have a call to action for the folks in this room around the many questions around trustworthy information and where we go from here as a field, broadly construed?
Yes. I think, so where we go from here as a field, I think there's a few key ways. Adoption of these methods is critically important. We talk about really, we're at the nascent stages of adoption, and the more people that implement, whether builders, content creators, distribution platforms, the more lessons we learn about how this needs to work well in practice. So adoption being one. Further research, both technically and socio-technically, to push on to understand, are there ways to merge multiple of these technical methods to overcome their weaknesses, and of any one method is brought up, including by some of PA's important work in this area too, but also socio-technically, understanding how well they're working in practice. And then as well, the media literacy efforts. So pushing on all of these areas, and I think these will be areas that require all of the different multi-stakeholder input levels.
Thank you. Do we have, I was negligent, but do we have time for one or two? Thank you, Caitlin. So you can blame me if you're very hungry. Any questions, preferably for Jessica? And if you could introduce yourself, that would be wonderful.
Hi, I'm Fiona Limadan from Fairly AI. We do risk and compliance testing for AI systems. So I had the privilege of speaking to Bruce McCormick, part of the C2PA framework. So the thinking back then was that it helps the good people to make sure people know that they're doing good things, not necessarily helping the bad actors from continue to produce deepfakes. I was wondering if that thinking has advanced, or there's things that we can actually do, because if you look at ransomware, Russia is the #1 producers of ransomware still today.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll just offer a few reflections. And Bruce McCormick, for those who don't know, is at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and has been involved in our work for quite some time. So we've always talked about the limitations of some of at least the transparency mechanisms as not being a panacea for synthetic content's challenges. And interestingly, in the latest set of case studies, we had two that were focused on child safety that basically make the point. It's all well and good that you have labels, and maybe trust and safety professionals or law enforcement can use those to prioritize, but that's not going to help if someone is trying to create intimate image abusive content or child sexual abuse material. They're not going to authenticate it and say that it has metadata. They're going to strip it out. So we've talked about that quite a bit, and that's why we also say at the input level, if you're going to filter certain models, make it harder to actually produce some of this nefarious content. If we think about the child safety examples, there's a lot of more upstream intervention. So while we've focused on the kind of transparency signals, and again, kind of elevating the good actors and maybe creating cultural norms where if you don't see that label, it's kind of raises an alarm bell. We've also always kind of in our writing and in kind of how we craft, even in our 5 takeaways on direct disclosure, we say, remember, this is not enough to actually thwart malicious activity, and that requires kind of legal, technical interventions upstream and kind of surfacing it in the context of these conversations so it's not perceived as a silver bullet for all content harms that may emerge from the technology. Do you have anything?
Yep, there's 3 things I would add to that. One is that, so building on what we were talking about, there's C2PA, there's also different types of watermarks you could use, there's other complementary approaches like fingerprinting that PA's glossary go into, but all of these methods are complementary, and there's an interesting area to explore. How could you reinforce those methods with each other to have additional layers of protection to recover some information if it's stripped? So I think that's one area that can help with accountability too. And I think as we think about malign actors, there's a whole spectrum, right? There's hobbyists all the way to nation state actors. And so the capabilities vary. If you have some of those stack techniques, there might be opportunities there to help in a certain subset of cases. And then all the way to the very advanced actors, that's where other tools like detectors can serve a role if all those other signals are missing and you want to have some signals to rely upon. And Sam at Witness has incredible research he shared about that and how frontline actors are relying upon those in some instances. And then the third piece I would bring up is just the idea that as there are cases of abuse too that would create deception, there's also an opportunity to use, and this was the original use case for C2PA, applying some of this type of metadata information to authentic content. So whether it's camera captured to actually assert what happened in reality and what actually took place as a way to have a counter proof point too if there's dispelling accounts.
I also realized I broke my cardinal rule of any PAI convening. C2PA equals Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, a mouthful. That is a Linux Foundation open standard to make more mechanistic, and keep me honest about the definition, cryptographically signed metadata, AKA signals attached to content for those who are less in this space that will travel with artifacts throughout the web once deployed. That is a mouthful. If someone can do that more elegantly, feel free. But I just want to make sure for people who are questioning what that is. We need elevator music for Albert.
My name's David Brenner. I'm the board chair of AI and Faith. My question's about Nudify software. Has that been part of your consideration? Unlike Ariana, I practiced law for 35 years before I wised up. And it seems to me that her point about building on existing models like the ADA in her context, that there's a lot to be done with privacy, existing common law privacy, and then specialized statutes like have been created in some states around Nudify software already. So invasion of privacy is a civil liability issue. You can sue for the invasion of your privacy. And as we've seen with the voting machine cases, that's a powerful tool to take on lies, right? How is it that we could build on existing common law and statutes to just restore reality to the situation, which is that you can't strip away somebody's privacy through software any more than you can do it in any other means legally?
So there are two parts to the question. One is, have we considered it? Yes, as a nefarious use case. We have a list. This isn't any intervention for that, right? But in our Appendix B of the framework, we delineate kind of a whole list. And I know that doesn't sound important, but getting that from a really diverse group of institutions is hopefully a contribution of harmful and responsible use cases. That is one. And I actually want to point to my colleague, Madhu Srikumar's work. She recently, I don't know the name of it, and shame on me, but she maps out kind of the different points for regulating foundation models. So she talks about the differences between kind of like a Hugging Face, which is a conduit to the underlying models within it, et cetera. And I think what you're bringing up is interesting from just an AI governance perspective, which is one, is there a domain for which we already have legal infrastructure, whether it's disabilities or, privacy and intimate privacy? And then second, what is the intervention point for it? Is it the application or is it the model that's undergirding that application? And I think the California Attorney General is starting to do just this. I don't know, don't quote me on the details of what they're ultimately advocating for, but I know they are targeting as intervention point the Nudify apps and trying to get them off the web. Of course, that confronts a ton of freedom of expression issues, which is a common tension we've heard in all of the dialogue. So we have not been advocating for a particular piece of legislation. We can't, we're a 501c3, but yes, we can contribute research. And I think you bring up an interesting point related to just governance more broadly of the application layer being one that makes this much quicker and cheaper and easier. That would be a really great way to throttle the problematic content that people agree upon as problematic, which is also an interesting area that came up about the politicization of some speech topics.
And I'd add, too, there's an interesting white paper Microsoft put out recently about protecting the public from abuse of generative AI systems. And it does go into a lot of areas of deception, has stats on that, but non-consensual intimate imagery being one of those categories as well, and lays out analysis of policy proposals and legislation about tackling the issue kind of all up. So it's an interesting piece, too, looking at what's in place and where we might go as well.
Seeing none, we will proceed to lunch, hopefully. Thank you. Let's thank Jessica.
Thank you.